Hello, welcome to Miss Peepers Reading Corner. I'm Katrina, aka Miss Peepers. Let's talk about books. Today I want to share with you a collection of short stories, Ghosts by Edith Wharton. Now, I think most readers know Edith Wharton for her more famous works, such as The House of Mirth or The Age of Innocence. But did you also know that she wrote ghost stories? I found this out recently and just had to get a hold of this book. And I'm so glad I did. This is a collection of stories that Wharton wrote between 1902 and 1937, many of which were published in various places, and then the author herself brought them together into a single volume. And these ghost stories are very much a product of their time, of the early 1900s. They are spooky, there are gothic elements, there's a lot of more psychological fear going on, more so than jump scares or gore or the sorts of things you often see in more modern horror. And not all of the ghosts are literal supernatural ghosts in the sense of spirits of the dead. Some of them turn out to be other things. This is such a delightful book, and it's a bit tough, I think, to talk about a book of short stories because I can't give you a full summary of the storyline, or if I try to summarize each one, I'll end up giving you spoilers because they are fairly short. So what I'll do instead is I'm going to talk about one of my favorite stories that's in here and tell you a little bit about it. Again, I won't spoil the ending for you, but I want to talk about why I like it, and it does extend to the entire book. There was not a single story in here that I disliked, which is pretty nice for me for an anthology. Usually there's something in there that I'm like, I could skip this one, but all of them I enjoyed to some degree, but this one was my favorite. It's called Miss Mary Pask. We follow a first-person narrator who has recently recovered from an illness. The narrator's friend's wife, Grace Bridgeworth, lives in America and is worried about her sister, and so she has asked that should he ever find himself in the neighborhood while he is traveling, that he look in on her and just make sure she's okay. So Miss Mary Pask lives out in the middle of nowhere. So when our narrator realizes that he is staying close to where Miss Pask lives, he goes out to visit her, and she's in the middle of nowhere. He hires a carriage to take him, and by the time they get there, it's dark, it's nighttime, there's fog, it's very gothic, it's very eerie. And then when he gets there, he realizes that he had forgotten, because of his illness, he'd suffered some memory loss. He had forgotten that in fact Miss Pask was dead. But he's already knocked on the door, and there is an answer. It's such a good story because it has this intense creepiness to it, where we have an unreliable narrator. He doesn't have a good memory, and he tells us that from the beginning. He also tells us from the beginning that he doesn't know if he is going to tell Mrs. Bridgeworth what happened to him. He hasn't figured it. He hasn't caught up the courage to do so. We know at the beginning that something bad is going to happen, and that he doesn't want to tell this woman's sister what he experienced at her house. It's so spooky. It's so spooky, and it's so well done. Like there were a couple of twists in the story. One is the memory that the sister is dead, and I'll stop there. There's another one later, but it all comes together in a way that in the hands of a lesser writer, it would have been completely ridiculous. I wouldn't have believed it. I would have said, "What is wrong with you?" But Edith Wharton has this way of describing the scene and speaking within the narrator's voice to describe the terror that he experiences. She does this in such a way that you fully believe everything that is happening. And that to me is the best sort of horror or suspense or thriller type story, is when you are along for the ride. and it is a ride, but it's an early 1900s ride. And I think for a modern horror reader, watcher of horror movies, there's a lot of, and there's nothing wrong with this, but there's a lot of really violence, there's a lot of gore, there's a lot of things jumping at you. And for me, my favorite sort of spooky stories are the ones that kind of get into you a bit, that sort of touch that part of your brain that's afraid of the dark, that like animal instinct from well before houses and electricity, right? That kind of spookiness to me is the most fun. And because a jump scare startles you in the moment. And those are fun too, but in a different way. The jump scare startles you in the moment. The gore makes you go, ugh, gross. But the frozen terror of realizing that you are face to face with something that you cannot understand and don't know how to deal with, that is truly spooky. And Edith Wharton taps into that throughout all of this. There are a lot of isolated locations, visiting a stranger. There's one story in which the main character is at a train station waiting to be picked up by his employer because or someone from his employer's house. He's come for a job, but that person never shows up. So he ends up accepting a ride from a complete stranger and going to that person's house. Oh, stay here for the night and then we'll drive you over tomorrow morning because it's late. It was late. And it's one of those things that it was a different time. It wouldn't occur to you to do that today, but today you could call an Uber. You could, stay in a hotel pretty easily for the most part, obviously depending on where you are, but for the most part, we have so many modern solutions. You'd call someone on your cell phone. The chances that you'd be truly isolated in that kind of a situation those chances are much lower. And so we don't rely on the kindness of strangers so much anymore, and often with good reason. But people did then, and it didn't always work out for them. There are also one or two stories that are not in the middle of nowhere, where there's one that takes place in the middle of a town, but there's something going on that's spooky, and this narrator and our main character isn't really sure what's happening or who she can trust or who she should talk to, whether she should say anything. And that in itself is a sort of isolation, even though physically she's not isolated at all. So if you like something that's lightly spooky, that's more psychologically driven, that's a little bit more, while there are supernatural stories in here, they aren't all. And, but they're all tapped into those things that give you pause, that make you concerned that make you question what's going on around you. If you like that, then I highly recommend this book. This was very fun to read, and I'm glad that I did. I was getting ready to go on to the rest of my day, and I forgot to open my September mysterious book. This is a book from the used bookstore. I bought a set of them, one for each month, and we're already ready to open September, which is bonkers to me. But let's do it. Okay. This is a book I've never heard of. It is Cold Sassy Tree. I love that title, by Olive Ann Burns. Here we go. Oh, same time period as the book I was just talking about. On July 5th, 1906, scandal breaks in a small town of Cold Sassy, Georgia, when the proprietor of the general store, E. Rucker Blakesley, elopes with Miss Love Simpson. He is barely 3 weeks a widower, and she's only half his age and a Yankee to boot. As their marriage inspires a whirlwind of local gossip, 14-year-old Will Tweedy suddenly finds himself eyewitness to a family scandal, and that's where his adventures begin. That sounds really fun. It's entertaining, extraordinarily moving account of small-town Southern life in a bygone era. Fun! When was this published? Okay, this was published in 1984, but it is set in 1906. This sounds like fun. A little bit lighter than some of the books that we've been opening recently, so that'll be a nice shift as we go into the fall. When I read this, I will let you know what I thought of it. But if you have read this, please let me know what you thought, and I'll see you in the next one.